This is the second part of a two-part series on storytelling. The first part was pretty clunky. If you made it through that, you're very, very brave. So what I want to do now is I want to go through a series of examples that I got from the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, sort of where I'm from. So I've got a lot of examples from down there. And I want to go through a few examples like that to just show you how you can look at storytelling once you begin asking those kinds of questions. The first example I am stealing shamelessly from a man named Keith Basso, who wrote a wonderful article called Stalking with Stories, which is about Western Apache genres of historical narrative. And these historical narratives all follow a very similar format. They all begin with, "It happened at," and then they fill in a place name. And then they tell a story, and the story is always a morality tale. Somebody always screws up in the story, and they're always punished for it. And then they're ended with, "It happened at," repeat the name. So when you hear "it happened at," you know that you've got one of these stories coming. And it's worth bearing in mind, by the way, that the place names will be places that people who tell and hear these stories would be familiar with. Okay, so the example I want to give you is the story of an Apache policeman. And it's important to understand this story takes place shortly after establishment of reservation, and the Apache policeman would be answering to a non-native policeman and essentially enforcing the rule of American law on his own people. So that's kind of the context here. But let me see if I can read this here. It says, "It happened at Men Stand Above Here and There. Long ago, a man killed a cow off reservation. The cow belonged to a white man. The man was arrested by a policeman living at Sibique at Men Stand Above Here and There. The policeman was an Apache. The policeman took the man to the head army officer at Fort Apache. There at Fort Apache, the head army officer questioned him. 'What do you want?' He said," the policeman said, "I need cartridges and food." The policeman said nothing about the man who had killed the white man's cow. That night, some people spoke to the policeman. "It's best to report him," they said to him. The next day, the policeman returned to the head army officer. "Now what do you want?" The policeman said, "Yesterday I was going to say hello and goodbye, but I forgot to do it." Again, he said nothing about the man he arrested. Someone was working with words on his mind. The policeman returned the man to Sibique. He released him at Men Stand Above Here and There. It happened at Men Stand Above Here and There. Okay, so that's the story. One way of thinking about it is it's a story about an Apache policeman who is willing to take his own people to a non-native for judgment. So it's a story of somebody who's trying too hard to keep white people happy. What's the punishment? Well, the man sort of loses track of what he wants to do and ends up making a fool of himself in front of the very white man he's trying to keep happy. So that's one way of looking at that story. That seems to be the moral of that story. And it's important to understand that when this story is told, that location, Men Stand Above Here and There, that location would be a location familiar to people who hear the story. So why would somebody tell this kind of story? Well, it happens that Basso, and this is why I chose this one, Basso actually had a chance to see this story in operation, so to speak. And he talks about how he had gone to a women's puberty ceremony, and a young lady showed up with curlers in her hair. And her grandmother told this story. And he sort of thought that the story might have been about this young lady. He met her several years later and asked her about it. And she told him, "Oh yeah, Grandma shot me with an arrow and I've been ashamed ever since." And she says, "I thought about it whenever I passed that location." So the point here, and believe me, you'll get the point a lot better if you actually read Basso's article, but the point here is that the stories are used in order to deliver a moral lesson and also to anchor that moral lesson in the Apache geography so that when people correct each other's behavior, they then build a reminder into the very landscape and that correction is reinforced simply by moving around and seeing these spots that are loaded with all the value of these stories. So that's one example of the use of a kind of, you could say, a traditional kind of story for a very specific purpose: moral correction and teaching. So the second example is something I experienced myself when I went to the Navajo Nation and began doing some research on Navajo youth gangs. And one of the questions that we were definitely interested in asking on that research project is why youth gangs were showing up on the reservation. And in the first couple of days before the project even officially started, I just happened to find myself alone in a room with an elder, and I thought, what the heck, I'll ask him. And what he told me was very, very brief. He just basically said the separation of the sexes. And it's a really interesting answer because it told me a lot about the way he was thinking about the issue and the way that a lot of the people he was associated with were thinking about the issue. He was alluding to a part of their origin narratives in which two very important characters, first man and first woman, sat down to dinner and had a falling out. And the details of the argument are quite interesting. For purposes of this class, we'll make sure that you get a copy. If you're watching the video for some other reason, I would Google around story of first man, first woman. You can probably find it somewhere. Anyway, suffice to say, they have a fight. And the fight ends not only with first woman leaving first man, but all the women leaving all the men. And so for a time, men and women live apart, which creates all sorts of problems. Not the least of which being that people begin engaging in what could be viewed as abnormal sex acts. And one of the results of that is the birth of a whole series of monsters. And monsters in this context would refer to a broad range of potential problems or things that could interfere with your life. So what was this elder telling me? He was telling me, on the one hand, almost a kind of Adam and Eve-like story, a kind of, here's the origin of problems in this world. But he was also alluding to a very, very serious phenomenon that he saw around him, namely what he perceived to be a high divorce rate. And so what he was suggesting, in other words, was that the problem was a lot of kids were growing up in broken homes. Now, how accurate or not that is a whole different question. But as an answer to my question, to my own question, why do you think youth gangs are showing up in the Navajo Nation? It was a very interesting and creative use of storytelling to tell me what he thought was up, essentially alluding to a model of life that suggests you need a man and a woman, and if for any reason that isn't happening, then you're going to get problems. So that's a second use of storytelling for a very clear purpose, in this case to try to diagnose a social problem and suggest an answer to it. So the third example I want to give you is an example of visual storytelling. And you can find it at the Bosque Redondo Memorial in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. This is a memorial to essentially a prison camp that housed the Navajo people from about 1864 to 1868. And there's an interesting story behind that. Essentially, a Army officer by the name of eventually General Carleton, General James Carleton, saw the area, fell in love with it, decided the Army really needed to build a military base there. The Army engineer that was sent to survey the area wrote back and said, this is a really horrible place to build a fort. There's not enough wood, there's not enough water, the water's poor quality, do not build a fort here. So what Carleton did instead was he built a reservation, and this would be an early reservation that really more or less served as an immediate prison camp during some of the wars of that era. And they first put 500 Mescalero Apache on it, and the man in charge of the agency at that point was very shortly writing letters saying, there are way too many people here, we've got to house them somewhere else. And instead of doing that, Carleton gave orders to Colonel Christopher Kit Carson to wage war on the Navajo people. And Kit Carson proceeds to bring in about 8,500 Navajo people who will then be housed at this same location. If you read the literature on this, often the word that is used is Roundup. It's sometimes called the Navajo Roundup. If you look at literature that's more sort of Navajo friendly or more focused on the Native point of view, they're more likely to talk about it as the Long Walk, because the march from their traditional homeland, a little bit south of the Four Corners area and into central northern Arizona, where Canyon de Chelly is, that walk was a brutal walk. A lot of people died along the way. There was a great deal of suffering. And so that walk itself is kind of a horror story. I shouldn't say kind of, it is. And then when people end up at this place, Bosque Redondo, which isn't well suited even to keeping 500 people safe and comfortable, and now there's 8,500 more, the situation is a lot worse. And so the US government spends about $1 million a year in 1860s money trying to keep this operation running. People are hungry, people are cold, crops aren't working, the whole thing is miserable. And as a result, think of it this way, the Bosque Redondo Memorial doesn't have a very positive tone. This is not a location that people really feel like celebrating. And so, they're going to tell the story of what happened there. And one of the things you can experience if you go to this memorial is you can walk down a hallway in which you will be surrounded by murals on either side. And this was painted by two different artists, a Navajo guy by the name of Shanto Begay and an Anglo-American by the name of Michael Scoville. And what fascinates me about this is, number one, the painting is done life-size. And so you're walking down a hall and you have images on either side. And some of the images are soldiers looking nice and threatening, and some of the images are of Navajo people being forced along. And as you're walking down the hallway, it's kind of hard to escape the notion that you're part of this, because you've got the images on either side of you. And what's particularly fascinating is you eventually come to a spot where you've got a particular image of a soldier that is pointing a gun straight out at the viewer. And if you're walking down the hall, it's pretty hard to evade a moment when that gun is pointed right at you. And as a storytelling element, this is really fascinating, because what it essentially does is it puts you in that story. And it does not put you in that story from the standpoint of the Army people. It puts you in the standpoint of the story of one of the folks that's being forced on that march. It's an interesting example of an attempt to immerse people in the story from a particular point of view. Going back to the concept of indexicality, he's pointing you right into the story. He's putting you into the story at the tip of a gun. So that's another example of storytelling and the use of context in storytelling to create a very specific meaning. One that you can't necessarily get just by saying, here's what happened. The next example I want to give you occurs on the other side of this Bosque Redondo story, and it involves a treaty negotiation that was done in 1868 in order to authorize Navajo people sort of going back to their original home. And it was pretty well understood by all parties at that point that that's what was going to happen, that Bosque Redondo was a disaster and that it was time for Navajos to go back where they lived. The main negotiator for the US government was General William Sherman. You've read about him in history books. The main negotiator for the Navajo people is Barboncito. You may not have read about him, but you should, because he's worth reading about. And the negotiations begin with a very simple question from General Sherman, essentially asking Barboncito why it was that his people were not flourishing in Bosque Redondo. Now, it's kind of a silly question. Sherman knew exactly why. It was a terrible place to try to hold that many people. But he asks anyway. And Barboncito's answer is really interesting, because Barboncito says, when the Navajo people are first created, and I guess I should take a moment before I even go that far to say there are some translation issues. You got to keep in mind, so Barboncito would be speaking Diné Bizad, Navajo. That was doubly translated. They didn't have anybody who could translate from Navajo to English present in 1868. So they had a translator take Barboncito's words and translate them into Spanish, and then they had another translator go from Spanish into English. So everything I'm about to say you got to take with a bit of a grain of salt, but I'm always fascinated by how much of what looks like Navajo thinking to me makes it into the text of this translation. So the bottom line is, Barboncito says, well, okay, when the Navajo people are first created, they're created by, or they're placed in the part of the landscape where they're supposed to live by First Woman, who is referred to as a god in this text. She basically says, according to Barboncito, that there are 4 sacred mountains and 4 sacred rivers, and Navajos are supposed to live right there, in between those 4 sacred mountains and 4 sacred rivers. And Barboncito says the problem is, the reason we're not flourishing is we're way to the east of those sacred mountains and rivers. We're in a spot we're not supposed to be in. And so he says, you know, back home, if a rattlesnake is going to strike, it gives a warning. We can get out of the way. Here, they don't do that so much. If we were struck, we could find a medicine. Here, we can't. There are a variety of ways in which he describes the landscape and the natural world as rejecting his people. And he says, this is why things are not going well. And then he proceeds to say, you know, we really do have to go home. You need to take us home because that's where we're supposed to be. Which is interesting on several levels, because what this indicates is, from the standpoint of Barboncito, it's not as though he can decide it's okay to live somewhere else. From the standpoint of General Sherman, hey, they're going to meet, they're going to talk, they're going to decide what's going to happen. And General Sherman even suggests, yeah, maybe you might want to go live, there's a couple other places. But for Barboncito, this is settled. The person who had the authority to decide where Navajos are supposed to live is First Woman, and the only question is how to get back. And he ends by saying a number of interesting things to General Sherman, including likening his own words to Sherman to those of a prayer. And it's kind of an interesting speech, because what he's doing is he's essentially reminding Sherman, or outlining for Sherman, a sense of the role that Sherman could play, namely that of completely recreating the Navajo universe, or putting it back the way it was supposed to be. And it's kind of an interesting narrative, because it's kind of complicated. It's not always that clear, you know, how literally we should take a comment like that. But there is some sense of parallelism there. Now, the last example I want to give you involves casinos. And what's particularly interesting about this is just how controversial the idea of a casino was in Navajo country around 96, 97 when I was out there. The Navajo legislature put forth a referendum, and this was, I believe, the 3rd such referendum, that would have authorized the creation of casinos in Navajo country. And this was, you know, still fairly early in the process of setting up Indian gaming. And so obviously what's happening here is the Navajo people were trying to decide whether or not they wanted to do that themselves. And they had already essentially voted no twice. But there were individuals that said, you know, hey, this is a good economic opportunity, we need to do this. So they created the referendum and went through the process a 3rd time. And there were a lot of arguments about whether or not to do casinos. And some of the arguments were very practical. They talked about, you know, who's going to actually gamble in these casinos? How useful are the casinos going to be for bringing in money, or are they going to take money from people within the tribe, people who maybe don't need to spend that money? Lots of interesting debates about the actual impact on their own population. But one of the things that was really fascinating about this, and this is where we get to storytelling, is that one of the principal villains in Navajo cosmology is a character who is often, whose name is often translated as the Gambler. And the story is such that, or the story goes roughly, that he starts gambling with various people and winning, and every time he wins, he gets something that's been bet. And over time, people start betting themselves. And the gambler eventually reaches the point where he's just about won the entire world. And there's just one bet left. He's eventually defeated in this last bet. Again, this is one of those stories that's just worth reading in its own right. And the story ends with the gambler being tied to a giant arrow and fired off into the sky. What's fascinating about this is the way that that story played into the then very current story of what does it mean to bring gambling onto the Navajo Nation. And there were a lot of people who commented on the parallel. There were a lot of people who looked at the prospect of setting up casinos and said, this is the gambler coming back. Given the way that the gambler ends up in that story, you can imagine how at least some people out in Navajo country might have perceived the prospect of setting up casinos on the reservation. This is essentially, kind of a deal with the devil, so to speak. And there were a number of newspaper articles and political cartoons that called attention to that. And one of the most interesting comes from an individual by the name of Vincent Craig, who at that time was, I think, the chief probation officer for the Navajo Nation. He was also a very well-loved entertainer. If you Google Vincent Craig and Rita, you'll find a wonderful song performance on YouTube. And he also did political cartoons. And one of the most interesting things that Vincent Craig did is he tied this issue to the question of sort of acculturation or of, what are the youth going to do? And so he begins this story by sort of focusing on some Navajo youth that are not particularly respectful of their own traditions, and a middle-aged Navajo guy that was a scientist, and he basically has this scientist come up with a culture pill. He designs a pill and gives it to his nephew. And his nephew had his head shaved all bald and was, kind of doing the gangster look. But he takes the culture pill and immediately his hair pops right back out, and he ties it in a Navajo bun and dresses traditionally and starts really echoing some traditional Navajo themes. And over the course of this political cartoon, which Vincent Craig repeated, in the weekly publication of the Navajo Times, he just kept coming back to it. Eventually, this kid ends up on the floor of the Navajo legislature telling them the story of the gambler in an effort to try to impress upon them why gambling is a bad thing. And I always thought, sort of independent of the pros and cons of gambling, that was a very, very creative use of storytelling for a number of reasons. I mean, it flips the usual value of elder to youth. Instead of the elders lecturing the youth, it's a young kid lecturing the elders. And it ties that older theme of, this sort of villain at the beginning of I don't want to say quite the beginning of creation, but, certainly in long ago times, to a very contemporary issue. And so it's another example of somebody telling a story not just because it's kind of an important abstract story that everybody must know, but because it was a story with a lesson that Craig wanted people to get then and there as they were facing, a decision at that particular moment. Now, as it happens, there are definitely casinos run by the Navajo Nation. They were set up long after I left the area. But anyway, I still think the Vincent Craig cartoons are a great example of storytelling. Okay, so what? What do all these stories do? What I'm trying to get at is that when you look at what we could think of as traditional stories belonging to any given people, there's a little bit of a tendency to assume that what we're doing is looking at this sort of archaic body of knowledge that is timeless. And what I'm trying to get at is that these stories, to the degree that they matter because particular people tell them. And they tell these stories in particular times and places to particular audiences. They do so for particular reasons. And one of the things that's always worth doing is asking yourself, why are people telling this story? What's going on in the act of telling the story? And I'm hoping that some of these examples can illustrate ways of going about that, or ways of answering that question, or at least some possibilities. But as you look at storytelling in any other context, you might think about asking some of these same questions.